Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Tierney's webinar, Hydrogen and Other Technologies, Policy Options for UK Zero-Emission Shipping. Just to let you know that we're recording this webinar and it will be made available on Tierney's website in due course. So my name's John Hood and I am the UK Sustainable Shipping Manager for Tierney. If anyone's unfamiliar with Tierney, we are an independent think tank and advocacy group. Our objective is a zero-emission transport system, and we work with a variety of stakeholders, including governments, industry, academia, and other NGOs, to produce evidence-based policy recommendations. Now, following recent agreement on a 2050 greenhouse gas strategy at the International Maritime Organization, and ahead of London International Shipping Week, this webinar will focus on the policy solutions needed to make zero-emission shipping a reality in the UK. And feed into our ongoing program of policy development. So we have a fine panel today to consider some of the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to zero-emission shipping in the UK. From the Methanol Institute, Chief European Representative Matthias Olofsson. From DFDS, the Director Innovation Lead Jaco Stevenson. From the UK Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology, the Head of Transport Fuels, Paul Thompson. And our keynote speaker is none other than the United Kingdom Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Kerry McCarthy. So huge thanks to our panelists for their time today. We would welcome your questions, so please do submit them through Zoom as we go. And once our panelists have spoken, we'll try and get into some discussion. Unfortunately, Kerry does need to leave us a little bit early, at about 20 to 3 UK time, but there should still be some time for some questions. So in a moment, I will hand over to Kerry, but first I would like to say a few words just to set the scene for today's discussion. So, Tierney analysis shows that in 2021, UK shipping emissions, combined domestic and international, totaled nearly 1/5 of UK transport emissions. The way that we've calculated this is contained in our analysis, which is on Tierney's website. And the link there is at the slide. So please do take a look at that. According to the Climate Change Committee, who in their 2023 progress report included content on shipping, there are currently no credible policies in place to deliver the required emissions reductions by the 6th carbon budget. And they've also said that there is no clear strategy for decarbonising the sector. It's also worth mentioning the International Maritime Organization, the 2050 strategy recently agreed, does not contain binding targets. Critically, it's incompatible with the temperature objective of the Paris Agreement. So Tierney recommends that the UK should regulate all of its shipping emissions, and that needs to be done through a visionary policy and regulatory framework to include binding time-bound targets, and one that also creates demand for large-scale zero-emission shipping, which needs to include fuels, electricity, energy efficiency, and energy-saving measures. Fuel switching will probably provide the bulk of the emissions abatement, but big reductions are also possible through energy efficiency measures, energy-saving measures such as wind assist and speed reduction. And our recommendation is that the government framework needs to incentivize all of these measures. Now, fuel switching we've spoken about, but analysis shows that the least cost abatement technologies that are both sustainable and sustainable are derived from renewable electricity, either through electrification, direct electrification, or through e-hydrogen and e-hydrogen-based fuels such as e-ammonia and e-methanol. Now, this does offer significant opportunities for the UK. The UK is already a leader in maritime services, and we have capabilities in zero-emission fuels and also battery electric technologies. So the opportunities are there for the taking. Now, earlier this year, the United Kingdom government published the Carbon Budget Delivery Plan, which contains assumptions for the uptake of low-carbon shipping fuels needed to stay within the carbon budget. That delivery plan sets out that in 2035, 28% of UK international shipping fuel needs to be low carbon, and 42% of UK domestic shipping fuel needs to be low carbon. That's a total of about 30, just over 30% of UK shipping fuels in 2035 needs to be low carbon. Well, Tierney has looked at the energy system implications of those assumptions using the technologies that we recommend. And we find that in order to meet those assumptions, it would take nearly all of the UK's total wind generation, electrical generation in 2021. And that only abates about 30% of UK shipping emissions. So hence why we're using the term visionary to describe the policy and regulatory framework that's needed. And because the cheapest of these fuels is likely to be at least 4 times more expensive than conventional fossil marine bunker fuels, normal market conditions will simply not deliver the changes that are required. The government must step in, and the question only really is how. So I think that's enough from me. I'll stop there. It gives me great pleasure to pass to Kerry McCarthy for our keynote address. And Kerry, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, John, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to join you, and I'm sorry that, as John said, I do have to be in the chamber by 2:45, so I will have to leave at about 22. But I hope we can sort of have a good discussion between now and then. I suppose the starting point is, Labour absolutely recognises the importance of the shipping sector in the UK. It supports 1 million jobs. It contributes nearly 50 billion annually to the UK economy and transports 95% of the UK's trade. But decarbonisation must absolutely be part of its future because, as we've heard, it's a significant contributor to transport emissions, which in themselves are the largest contributor to the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. Using the activity-based approach the Climate Change Committee has recommended, rather than just estimates based on domestic fuel sales, and for international shipping, Transport and Environment puts shipping carbon dioxide emissions at more than double the official count, which of course makes it even more imperative that we take action. It's not just the climate impact. Air pollution at ports is a serious problem, with domestic shipping accounting for around 16% of the UK's NOx emissions, while NOx emissions from international shipping are 3 times higher. As has been said, shipping emissions will be, well, it was sort of said in talking about the Committee on Climate Change criticism of the government. They will be included in the 6th carbon budget, which runs from 2033 to 37. And the carbon budget delivery plan pathway requires a decrease of around 22% by 2035 on 2019 baseline levels. But as has been said, this is not being backed up by policies to deliver change. I think there's partly a sense that shipping has been parked in the too difficult to deliver pile, partly because, or largely because, of the international element of it, and in large case it's being left to international organisations like the IMO to try to push for action, voluntary action. The Committee on Climate Change, as has been said there's no clear-cut strategy at all for decarbonising the sector. There are some exciting opportunities, I think. There was a report for the government in 2019 that shortlisted 11 abatement options for shipping, and there was a long list of nearly 40, but it brought it down to 11, including hydrogen, methanol, ammonia fuels, as well as shore power, onboard batteries, electric engines, and wind propulsion. And I over the summer recess, it's our first day back in Parliament today, I visited Harland Wolff, the shipyard down in Appledore in Devon. And I know that they're really excited about being part of this transition to clean energy. Down on the Celtic Sea, there's going to be a huge amount of offshore wind put in place, and they would love to produce the service vessels that could support that. And they want it to be clean vessels, but they do need support, and it would help safeguard the future of the shipyard if they could be supported with that. The worry is that there's very little by way of investor confidence, particularly because just the political debate about net zero and the government being seen to row back on action or sending out confusing signals is problematic. It's also needs to be a joined up approach, because it's not just you need to look at things like port infrastructure, you need to look at grid connectivity, And of course, as I said, shipping is an international business, so it needs international collaboration. Whereas if you look at other sectors, you will see there's a SAF mandate for sustainable aviation fuel, there's a mandate for zero-emission vehicles, and the upcoming bans on the sale of new diesel or petrol cars and gas boilers. These are mechanisms that are designed to create demand and give businesses security to invest. But whereas the government says that it has a vision for zero-emission ships to be commonplace globally by 2050, there's no strategy to support that, no clear mechanisms. They say there's a zero emission ambition intended to provide aspirational goals for the sector, not mandatory targets. And this included an expectation that ships would maximise energy efficiency by 2025 and all new orders would be for zero emission ships. But we know that just relying on hopes and dreams and aspirations will not get us to net zero. As the Committee on Climate Change has noted, and as John mentioned, there are currently no credible policies in place to get us there. A consultation on the potential for a phase-out date for the sale of new non-zero emission domestic ships is over a year late. The review of the Clean Maritime Plan has been delayed by a year and is still only set to offer indicative targets and only for domestic ship-ins. And also the promised consultation on shoreside electricity has been delayed for 2 years. With only a call for evidence so far. I'm conscious of time. I'm very sure that you don't want me to just be here criticising what the government's done and want to hear a little bit about Labour. I hope that you're familiar with our well, there's two things. One is that Keir Starmer has come up with 5 emissions that cover what we want to achieve in government. 2 of those are very relevant to this. One is making Britain a clean energy superpower by 2030, and another one is securing the highest sustained growth in the G7. And also very much as part of that, it is about putting green policies and that just transition at the heart of our industrial strategy, which is where our Green Prosperity Plan, which I hope you've heard about, 28 billion a year in capital investment. I would say it's a response to President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, but it actually came before that. But we are certainly very much pushing the government now to respond to what Biden has done and what the EU has done in response to IRA as well, to have an interventionist policy that helps us, because if not, a lot of this investment and the skills and the expertise will be attracted overseas. The government study on the economic opportunities from zero emission shipping estimated, based on the then export market share, that those 11 abatement options that were shortlisted could be worth between $650 to $890 million per year to the UK, and maritime decarbonisation could support 220,000 jobs by 2050. I can't be too specific about how we will be spending this 28 billion, because this is something we want to make sure that we do the groundwork, we do the number crunching, we get our numbers right. Slightly hampered in that by the fact that we don't have access to all the resources that government has, although that we're hoping we will get access to civil servants by the end of this year, if not sooner, which will very much help us with that. But to give an idea of where we're going, focus will be very much on, as I said, a just transition, particularly in areas where they are traditional industries, whether that's something like steel or shipbuilding or the oil and gas sector, so that they can still have, good unionised, secure jobs, but helping us meet our net zero challenge. We've said we'll introduce a British industry bonus to reward clean energy developers that invest in good jobs and supply chains in Britain's industrial heartlands and coastal communities. We've also said we'll establish an £8 billion national wealth fund to invest in green manufacturing capacity and attract private sector investments. And we have allocated £1.8 billion to upgrade ports, to have green ports, charging infrastructure and so on across the UK. But we realise that spending money is not enough, and obviously we're keen to not have to spend money we can't. I think there's huge potential to leverage in private sector investment if the right signals are sent. And some of that is removing obstacles, so obstacles in the planning system, access to the grid, providing regulatory clarity, supporting investor confidence, ensuring the skills are there, but also perhaps some mechanisms that reward those people that want to go faster and make sure that there's a level playing field, and that involves working with the shipping industry to focus on the most viable options, working with ports and local authorities to deliver the necessary infrastructure, and as I said, supporting the right skills so that we can source the fuels and technology domestically. I think so. I suppose just in conclusion, we absolutely accept that this is an important sector. It shouldn't be left on the too difficult pile any longer. Indeed, we have a big international role to play because of our past history of international trade and shipbuilding and so on. So I would very much like, I hope as we approach COP later this year, and I'll be attending for part of that, the international shipping is very much on the agenda there as well, and the UK is playing a leading role trying to get other countries to be on board. Thank you.
Perry, thank you so much for your words. I found that quite motivating, and there are clearly some very important points that you made. I'm really pleased to hear about the opportunities, the value of maritime decarbonisation in the UK, which is absolutely what Tierney shares and supports, and also the investment, the green manufacturing, 8 billion wealth fund that you mentioned, and also the fund for green port allocations, green port upgrades, which is going to be absolutely fundamental for things like shoreside electricity. So thank you so much for your words. I would now like to pass across to Paul Thompson of REA to talk a little bit about policy, specifically the renewable transport fuel obligation in the UK. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. Can someone just confirm they can see my pictures there? Excellent, thank you very much. So I think bear in mind that we need to crack on with things. The obvious place to start, and what I'll be talking about, is working with what we've already got. We already have a well-established renewable fuels policy, its financial incentive that's been with us for a while. And so a good starting point is to look at that. What have we actually got? What are its strengths and weaknesses, and how could we adapt it and indeed go beyond it in order to achieve what we want to achieve. I would stress this is a fuels policy. I'm well aware that a lot of other work would be doing on infrastructure and shipping and elsewhere. So there we go. So the policy we've got is called the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation, RTFO, which just saves a lot of words to type. It's an obligation on fossil fuel suppliers to replace a percentage of their fossil fuels with renewables. So in sort of policy land, that's a portfolio obligation. In other words, it's across the range of fuels that are supplied overall. Fuel used in inland waterways is also included, but primarily it's focused on land transport, in other words, road transport. The current target is for just over 13% of fuels to be renewable, rising to 17.7% in 2032. It covers conventional biofuels, so bioethanol, biodiesel, as well as what the policy calls renewable fuels of non-biological origin. The abbreviation for that is REFINBOs, which everyone objects to until they have to say it more than once, in which case they go, okay, REFINBO it is. Under the policy, all fuels used have to meet sustainability criteria. Those cover minimum greenhouse gas savings that are required, and also some, and I would stress, not as much as in an ideal world one would have, but some also wider environmental impacts and land use aspects as well. Suppliers, in other words, fossil fuel suppliers, can meet their obligation in any one of three ways. They can themselves put renewable fuels on the market. They can present to the scheme administrator a certificate, so accounting schemes that someone else, for fuels that someone else put on the market, or they can pay a buyout price. In other words, that currently for 50 pence per litre of their obligated amount, they can pay that money instead of supplying the fuels. And that's intended as a cap to protect consumers, because essentially it caps the maximum liability that consumers might end up bearing. Those targets are set to 2032. Department for Transport is consistently at pains to emphasise this doesn't mean the scheme stops then, but equally, they haven't said what they want to happen after that. So that's a crucial thing that we're waiting for clarity on. The vast majority of deployment are those conventional biofuels blended in relatively small volumes into the petrol or diesel. And we'll come to the implications of that in a minute. Very little of the main obligation is in fact bought out, so that part of the mechanism is working as a kind of a safety valve rather than broadly the way that people choose to comply. Suppliers are in fact supplying fuels rather than not. There is also a development fuel sub-target, and that has a higher buyout price. The reason for that is wanting to support various fuels that cost more, including the sorts of ammonia and methanol type fuels, but have longer term strategic reason for wanting to have them, either because of the particular feedstocks that we want to encourage people to use, or processes that we hope over time will get cheaper, or harder to decarbonise sectors, such as marine or, for that matter, aviation. I imagine the slides will be shared afterwards, but this again just shows you sort of what you'd expect, that the policy has been broadly successful in terms of rising percentages of fuel being renewable over time. The reason those numbers don't match the 13% target is there is a rather complicated accounting mechanism involving some double counting of rewards. Actually the graph here is the one that should be taken at face value. And obviously you can see there was quite a blip over the COVID period, but things have more or less returned to what the trend they were before. That's not in fact entirely reassuring, because that means that demand for road transport fuel has continued to rise over time. So rather than go straight into the negatives, I just want to talk very briefly about the positives. It's a long-term, well-understood policy. It has independent reporting on the sustainability. So again, we have a high level of control and confidence in the statistics that are being presented. At least, one might dislike the methodology or support it, but that's very useful. It's all derived from EU-based renewable energy directives. So there's a high level of similarity with what's being reported elsewhere, is being reported elsewhere in Europe. Not exactly the same, but it's recognisable in the same sort of world. And the main obligation has driven significant deployment, i.e. use of these fuels in the UK market. Based on its methodology, it gives average savings of 83% in terms of the fossil fuels. The vast majority of those are made up from waste feedstocks, and the total greenhouse gas savings over the year that all these stats are taken from, which is 2021, is over 5 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So it's a significant contribution to decarbonisation. And there is the potential, emphasise the word potential, to stimulate, to use the sub-targets for development fuels to bring forward those fuels as well, alongside the main obligation. On to the not so good points, and apologies, this is a longer slide. Only 10% of the fuels supplied are produced in the UK. That's because it's a supply side policy rather than a demand side. It's pretty agnostic for where the fuels come from. It also that becomes a big problem when we're talking about these innovative fuels, because there isn't a huge amount of them being produced at the moment. So if we want to set ambitious targets to get and use those fuels, we're going to be competing with everyone else if we're not simultaneously trying to produce as much of those as we can in the UK. One reason why the RTFO and that 10% number has stayed pretty consistent over time, one reason why I think that's true, it's difficult to fund new projects, is unlike a number of other renewable energy support schemes, it's not guaranteeing a level of support. That buyout price I referred to is a cap on the maximum amount you could get, not essentially a guaranteed minimum. Perhaps more significantly, it doesn't directly reward the producer of the fuel. It's providing an incentive on fossil fuel suppliers to put fuel on the market by creating a cost that they will try to avoid, if you like. It isn't necessarily putting any money in the pocket of the fuel producer, and therefore it's very hard to fund a project, even if you think the numbers stack up on that projected revenue, because you have no control over it. The development fuel target has had very limited effect so far. So when we're talking about these innovative fuels that are going to hopefully play a very significant role in maritime fuels, it's done very little. And there could be a number of reasons for that, but we definitely need to understand that. And cost is also a serious concern. So the RTFO is paid for by motorists. Motorists' cost of motoring is a very politically hot red button, has been for years. So whenever the government proposes higher levels of ambition, the first question they and ministers ask is, what will the headlines be as to how much have I put up the cost of motoring? And that's obviously a concern. And I think also there's a history over several years of quite poor coordination within the Department for Transport between the people working on zero emissions vehicles and the people working on fuels policy. So they pretty much are, I'm sure they do talk to each other, but the impression is certainly that they are very siloed. A tiny bit here on what the RTFO actually does cover with shipping. For inland waterway vessels, all fuels that are eligible for the RTFO can claim support for that. Refinbos, but only refinbos, can claim support if using ships that normally operate at sea as well. The difficulty here, though, is that the policy itself is in no way creating a demand for those fuels. So if there were a demand for those fuels, people would be able to get the incentive for using them, but it doesn't actually give anyone any kind of push or nudge to do so. I wanted to make one more comparison with another area that has seen a huge amount of activity that Kerry referred to, which is sustainable aviation fuels. I think there is an element of too difficult, but I think, to be honest, there's a level of political interest. Aviation is cool and exciting, guilt-free flying is much more attractive than thinking about where all the goods that you order on the internet come from. And there's no denying that the aviation industry is very well connected within government and very professional in its engagement, lobbying. Part of the reason the sustainable aviation fuels policy has advanced really quite with a lot of ambition, sometimes actually dragging the department, with the ministers dragging the department along behind them, is because of that level of political interest, particularly when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. Anyway, the net result is that we have a commitment from the UK government to introduce a SAF mandate, essentially another version of the RTFO. Government has committed that will be in force from 2025. So depending on the timing of the next election, there's a good chance that that legislation will be passed before the election. And there are a number of detailed points that are yet to be resolved that we had a consultation on early in the year, and we're expecting before Christmas. So that should be pretty much done and dusted as a policy by the end of this year.
Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt you. And would you be able to sum up now, please?
Yeah, I'm pretty much there. There's a number of things that we can learn from that we need. The RTFO is useful, we can adapt it, but a lot of extra policy will be needed. In particular, the RTFO doesn't create a demand side, and it doesn't really make sense at the moment for people to make investments in the UK. So all the strategies, other policies are likely to be needed to make that part of the picture work, even from a fuels point of view, as well as the interaction with ships and infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you so much for that detailed summary of the RTFO and the pros and cons. I'm very struck by the RTFO's success, as you mentioned it, in ensuring genuinely low carbon fuels, but that 10% figure does stand out. In a world where we're wanting to see large amounts of zero emission shipping fuel produced in the UK, that's perhaps something that we can learn from for a shipping policy mechanism. I am conscious of time, and I think given that Kerry needs to leave us in about 10 minutes time, perhaps if we could hear from Jaco now, and then we have a number of questions, one or two of which I'd like to pass to Kerry before she goes, and then once Kerry has left us, then if we could hear from Matthias, if that would be okay. So, Jaco, I'd like to pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, John. See if I can share. Does it look okay? Can you see my slides, John? Okay, good. My name is Jaco Stevenson. I'm innovation lead at DFDS. DFDS is this integrated shipping and logistic company. Our main operation is up here in the northern Europe, but we also do a lot of business in the Mediterranean. We have a lot of big ships and skilled employees, and our decarbonization targets is a 45% reduction by 2030 and to become climate neutral by 2050. I know I can't switch the slides. Yeah. The shipping industry starts to have a good idea about how we can decarbonize. Global shipping, big international shipping. There we see that we can switch to green ammonia and methanol. There are still some safety concerns, but it falls under the category which we can actually handle. We are looking into that the fuel will be via barge, and that makes the minimum requirement for short side infrastructure. It is important for the shipping companies to be allowed to refuel while doing cargo operations, because otherwise we need to spend more time in port, and then we need to sail faster to maintain the schedule, and that requires us to use a lot of additional fuel, which would be bad. The new generations of zero-emission ships, they will be more expensive, but that is actually not the biggest pain point. The biggest pain point is the big price difference between the green fuels and the fossil fuels that we are using today. When we're looking at the short sea shipping, for instance, all the ferries we have that trade between Dover and France, there we see that a very good candidate to decarbonize them is batteries, and basically just make them electrical ships. Alternatively, we could also go for hydrogen for short sea shipping. Again, safety is a big concern, but what we have learned is that we can actually handle the issues. Electricity and hydrogen cannot be supplied via barge. So these kind of ships will require expensive shoreside infrastructure, for instance, in the power grid. And again, it's important for us to be able to refuel or recharge while doing cargo operations. These kind of ships, battery-powered ships or hydrogen-powered ships, they're going to be like very expensive. But we are looking into that that electricity as a fuel and hydrogen as a fuel is actually going to be the cheapest of the expensive green fuels. So it kind of like balances the business case. We start to have a very good idea about what the first generation of alternative powered ships look like, and we are very confident that we can actually build these ships. But the big issue is that the business case does not add up. And as I mentioned before, yes, the ships are going to become more expensive, but the biggest issue is the high cost of the green fuels, and that it is so cheap to run on fossil fuels. It's this price gap that we need to have reduced. On my last slide, I would like to share some insights into what have slowed down our green transition and what could help to speed it up. On the downside, it is the high cost of the sustainable fuel. It just makes these business cases very difficult to produce. We have also been waiting for instance, the engine technologies, for instance, ammonia-powered engines, but those technologies are just about ready now, so almost no excuse left there. And one thing that has been a big eye-opener for DFDS is that we have actually wasted a lot of time applying for funding. Organizations like ours, we are not designed to make these huge and complicated funding applications. And every time we apply for a hydrogen ship, a battery ship, or to make a small series of ammonia-powered ships, Then we spend a lot of time producing them. Then we file the applications, and we hope, and then we're turned down. And then our top management asks us to do please try it one more time. And every time it just slows us down with 6 months or 12 months, etc. What could really help to speed up the green transition of the shipping industry, from our point of view, is to set clear emission reduction targets and reliable mechanisms to ensure that these targets will actually be met. And it would also be a very effective mechanism to make it more expensive to continue to operate ships on traditional fuels by requiring a steady reduction of the greenhouse intensity by, for instance, mixing in increasing percentage of non-biological renewable fuels, the RFNBOs. That would have it would make the black fuels more expensive, but it would also help to bring scale to the production of the renewable fuels, which will help to reduce the cost of those also. Contracts for difference would be such a nice alternative to having to apply for funding. And I think it's specifically if for instance, if you look at the Dover operation, there, all the ship owners down there, it looks like we are all hoping to decarbonize by making a fully electrical powered ship, and it just requires a lot of shoreside infrastructure to the grid. And we don't dare to start building the ships unless we feel sure that we will actually be able to charge them. And then I think, like for instance, a plan for when we will be able to bunker green hydrogen or green ammonia in, for instance, the top UK ports. Again, while we are loading and discharging, it's not like we are asking for a plan for all the UK ports. But if you, for instance, look up at here, if you look at Immingham, then we could reach almost maybe like 1/3 of our ships could be refueled with green fuel here. And if you look at Dover, I think we have 6 vessels calling there 8 times a day or something like that. So just a few places will have a big impact. That was what I have prepared, and looking forward to the dialogue. So back to you, John.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Really, really interesting to think about the potential of the UK there as a zero-emission fuel supplier. But you've also been very clear about the cost gap between traditional fossil marine bunker fuels, zero-emission fuels, and spoken a bit about the potential ways of bridging that cost gap, which is very interesting, very helpful to think about. So thank you so much for your words. Kerry, I'm conscious that we just about out of time, but there have been a number of questions for you, and I wonder whether I can pose one of the ones that stands out particularly just before you leave us, which concerns the UK's approach to domestic and international shipping emissions. As you're aware, the International Maritime Organization recently agreed a 2050 strategy that is not aligned with the temperature objective of the Paris Agreement, and the UK's Clean Maritime Plan indicates that the refresh of that will only be domestic shipping. Are you able to say any words on how Labour might potentially commit to reducing UK international shipping emissions, and would you have any thoughts on the possibility of setting a binding 2030 target for all UK shipping emissions?
I suppose my starting point, apologies because I do have to run down to the chamber in a moment, is Labour pushed for international emissions to be on the agenda COP when UK was hosting it, because, as I said, it was something that we didn't feel we could leave to the voluntary approach within the sector. The problem is with looking at targets is that we've had years, and as I saw another one of the questions in the chat, that climate policies, particularly on transport, seem to have been stuck in government for the last couple of years. We've had, particularly last year or the last 12 months, huge amount of uncertainty just in terms of, direction of travel of the government, and we know that the you said, as Chris Skidmore set out very powerfully in his report, and as the Committee on Climate Change said in its report, that things have stagnated. And the problem is that we have another year of that, because we're not expecting the election till autumn next year. That means we're in late 2024. We take over hopefully win the election. We're getting ever closer and closer to that target, with no progress having been made in the interim years. So we have to look at what we inherit. We want to be as ambitious as possible. I think it's, as I said, we certainly agree that we've got to be looking at international shipping emissions as well as domestic shipping. But in terms of what actual, we need to be realistic. We know that the Clean Power by 2030 target is ambitious in itself, and we're trying to look at the obstacles like planning, like grid connectivity, like investment and skills that will stand in the way of that. But I think we do need to look at where the international picture is. But I think certainly, I think it was quite inspiring the last presentation to sort of see just what the potential is out there. And I suppose the one thing that I can say that myself and my colleague in the shadow transport team that leads on maritime can sort of try to ensure that shipping isn't the poor relation when it comes to these discussions, and that just because it's not the most, I think by comparison with aviation, just the fact is that everybody, or nearly everybody, takes aeroplanes or sees aeroplanes in the sky, and they don't realise how important, the fact that an awful lot of the goods that we purchase will come by boat, for example. But as I said, we've got the green ports thing, we've got the clean power. We are now looking at what we will be asking of the government ahead of COP later this year. But I can just say, without sort of committing to anything in particular, I just sort of say that, I can promise you that we will try to make sure that maritime is up there in a way that it wasn't and hasn't been to date. And on that note, I'm terribly sorry, but I do have to run, or the speaker I'll be in trouble with the speaker. So I would be interested in seeing the slides as well, I would say, because I thought there was some useful, and I've noted down all the questions as well for me to talk to colleagues about. So thank you for inviting me along.
Well, thank you so much, Kerry, for appearing today, and for those closing thoughts from you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, bye.
Okay. Matthias, apologies for bumping you in the queue there. If you would like to come in now and tell us a bit about the perspective of a zero-emission marine fuel supplier, you have the floor.
Very good. Thank you, John. I'll just put on my slides. So thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to present at the webinar. I'll be sort of reporting on the recent sort of integration of e-methanol and methanol into maritime transport, and kind of reflect on how that development has taken place, and what sort of enabling conditions were put forth that delivered that result, which could be replicated or improved on for the integration into the UK's marine fuel pool. First, briefly about the association I represent. We're the Global Trade Association of the methanol sector, offices in DC, Brussels, Delhi, Singapore, and Beijing. And we represent just about, most of the world's methanol producers, producers of methanol in all formats, technology suppliers, distributors, and recently consumers of methanol. So among our membership is Maersk, COSCO, MSC, Danaos, CMA CGM, Oldendorf, some of the largest shipping companies in the world. Methanol is traditionally produced from fossil feedstocks. There are two renewable pathways to methanol production. E-methanol, which is my background, as I used to work for CRI in my native country of Iceland, where we produced for the first time in the world e-methanol at scale by combining hydrogen generated by electrolysis of water with captured carbon to produce e-methanol back in 2012. And then there's the biomethanol route, which we won't be covering this webinar. but that is essentially gasification or fermentation of advanced biomass to produce an advanced biofuel. So methanol is it's only been about four years that we've been talking about methanol in the context of the energy transition of maritime transport. It has happened so fast, and it used to be methanol's use in chemicals for formaldehyde production or acetic acid, but now it seems all the association does is to give insights on methanol's integration into maritime, and I think it's worth it to reflect on how this came to be. Today, we're expecting 190 vessels on the water within 3 years from now. And looking at projections from Lloyd's Register, about 1,200 vessels are expected in 2030, which amounts to about 48 million tons of methanol, whereas currently today, methanol is produced in about 100 million tons. So you can see that the demand coming in from maritime is transforming the industry. And we did a work with the International Renewable Energy Agency on projecting how methanol how growth will take place in the segment, and it projects that about 400 million tons additionally of methanol will be in the fuel pool in 2050, and almost all of that growth is attributed to renewable formats of methanol, mostly e-methanol, but also a large portion in the biomethanol pathway. And we had that forecast updated by Roland Berger, where the result was that they projected an even larger increase or a larger growth in the segment in 2050. So it's clear that there is a direction of travel in the methanol sector globally, and a lot of it is driven by energy applications of methanol, such as maritime transport. So how did this happen? What kind of conditions were set that enabled this development? First, I'd say it's harmonized regulatory framework. We've been waiting for a long time for clarity with regards to what kind of sources of CO2 would be eligible for production of fuels, what kind of provisions did we have to respect in the industry to make sure that the electricity would be considered renewable, which was used for the production of fuels. And so forth. What conditions did they have to abide by in the industry to make sure that the fuel that we were producing was indeed renewable and met a greenhouse gas criteria? And now that has been established, a lot of momentum has taken place. The other thing is investment security. Some sort of vision for investors to be able to understand that there is a long-term demand for the product, and they can rely that their investment won't become obsolete in a few years' time. And finally, some first mover initiative to kind of drive this development. And obviously, in our case, this was the announcement made in 2020 by Maersk that they were investing in a methanol-propelled container vessel. And how do you set these enabling conditions? Because these conditions didn't just occur; they didn't just naturally get there. There was a very stringent, very difficult path to setting a regulatory environment which supports these sort of enabling conditions, which then again deliver a significant development in the fuel supply chain. And what I think is worth it to highlight is the merit of a basket of measures that addresses the entire value chain. It's having a mechanism like the RTFO addressing the supply side is important, but not sufficient in order to fully address the sort of integration of alternative fuels or sustainable alternative fuels into maritime transport. First, there needs to be demand signals and taxation, and there I'm referring to kind of long-term binding targets with an incrementally rising performance-based trajectory, and there needs to be a penalty behind it. Then a mandated minimum supply, which is already quite recognized as a policy instrument to drive energy transition, and then finally to factor in climate performance of energy carriers into energy taxation policies. Secondly, there has to be some sort of flexibility. We've mentioned pooling, mass balancing, or book and claim. I won't go into great detail about what these entail, but essentially making it easier both for the obligated party and for the fuel supplier to deliver the product to the market, whether it's about chain of custody methods, calculation for inputs, or about being able to pool compliance among those that are obligated. Third, finance has to be a part of the equation. It's quite noticeable that if taxonomy policies, if ESG policies measure greenhouse gas intensity, for example, on different grounds, then the regulations that regulate emissions in maritime or in any mobility segment, then that will impact their ability to integrate. And we've highlighted the importance of making sure that green finance regulations are aligned with marine fuel integration objectives. Finally, infrastructure has to be a part of the equation as well. That we've recommended under the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation in the EU to talk about mandatory infrastructure deployment targets in ports, or any other instrument which supports ports to deliver that infrastructure to facilitate the integration. Now, what can the United Kingdom do? I would recommend to supplement the RTFO supply side mechanism with some sort of long-term demand-inducing policy instrument, as I mentioned, targets, penalties, and other methods to attain that progress. Expand climate policies to reflect the entire value chain. As said before, it couldn't either be a supply side and a demand side mechanism. It has to address the entire value chain to address the kind of significance of what we are trying to achieve, which is to alter the way we propel, well, in this case, our vessels, but also society in general. And then send clear investment signals to fuel producers, and that is by giving a kind of a long-term investment signaling, and give a trajectory as well, so that it's realistic and clear. And the fact that the United Kingdom is now outside of the European Union, regrettably though, is because it has some potential opportunities associated with making these policies less fragmented, not in the form of a directive, and sort of efficiently implemented. And these are our contacts, and that's it for my contribution. I hope I didn't take too long, John. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matthias. If you would be able to, thank you. Perfect. So yeah, well, I thought that was really interesting with this, and what came through very strongly was, for me, was the need for targets, both fuel supply and infrastructure. And I think that was an interesting reflection on a pooling mechanism as a way of easing compliance, which I know is something which is part of fueling maritime regulation. So perhaps that's also something that the UK needs to consider. I think we've got just enough time for a question or two. And that last point on pooling, it's linked to European regulation, might be a good segue into a question that we've had, which I think I would probably direct to all of you, which is whether the UK in its domestic policy and regulatory framework should try to reflect what the EU has done, particularly on fueling maritime, setting a greenhouse gas intensity standard on ships calling at UK ports, and mandating the FUNBOs, but then potentially also an element of the alternative fuels and infrastructure regulation around requiring vessels to use shore power. So should the UK seek to introduce something similar, or is there scope for the UK to perhaps improve upon those regulations and do things differently?
Yeah, I think maybe if I could answer first, I would say that that these policies, the Fit for 55 policies in the EU, have effectively addressed the problem and produced the adequate investment signals, which have in reality impacted fuel supply chains to react, and thus there's sufficient grounds to recommend that the UK would mimic those policies. At the same sense, making it less complicated and more efficient, I would see a huge opportunity for the UK to do a sort of similar exercise, except with sort of in a more speedy and efficient manner.
Thanks,
If I could just add to that. Yeah, I mean, as we've seen with aviation, it's not so much that the UK has to match exactly what the EU does, but if the policies are broadly comparable and broadly equivalent in ambition, then that also helps not only send signals, but also avoid the risk of carbon leakage, where people try to get around these policies by choosing different places to go to. One area where the UK, I think, could improve its game also is on its policies in terms of hydrogen and the rule book for how exactly electricity can be considered as renewable and counter the system. The UK's approach, certainly under the RTFO, is now quite a lot more restrictive than where the EU ended up. And that's, again, part of the mood music that sends slightly discouraging signals to people considering investing in production or using the fuels in this country.
Thank you very much, Paul and Matthias. We have 2 minutes left. Very quickly, I'd like to ask a very quick final question, which is, how ready is the UK to scale up supply of zero-emission shipping technologies should the demand signals be correct?
From a ship owner point of view, we're quite focused on, for instance, on the Dover operation. And right now, what I think all 3 ship owners down there looking into is that we would very much like to introduce electrical powered ships. But what we see is that for instance, the electrical grid on the UK side is nowhere near able to support that, and a lot of additional renewable electricity need to be put up. We cannot tell our customers that oh yeah, it's sustainable green transport if the energy doesn't come from renewable sources. So, and those projects take a long time to plan. So
I should also, just to build on that, would be that if we get things right, you'll see action beginning quite quickly, but this is still quite a long-term game.
Good, thank you both so much. Well, we are at time, more or less. So just by way of summary, I think this has been a fascinating, very helpful discussion. We've heard a lot about the challenges in the UK of scaling up zero-emission shipping. We've heard that some of the solutions, we've heard the need for targets, support like a contract for difference. Certainly investors need clear signals. We've looked at potentially prioritizing fuels and talked about the need for a stable targeted mechanism. So I think this is all extremely helpful material for policy packaging in the UK. And of course, I was very much encouraged by Kerry's final comment on Labour wanting to give shipping the attention that it deserves under a Labour government. So I think that's perhaps a suitably optimistic note to end on. I would like to thank all of our panelists so much for their time and expertise. And also thank you so much to our participants for coming and listening and for submitting their questions. Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.